Hey everyone, John Chappell with you for the third and final PowerPoint of this week. This one focuses on the events in Chicago, August of 1968, the Democratic Party National Convention. This is the longest of the three, so I don't want to talk at the speed of an auctioneer, but I'll probably be talking a little bit more quickly in this one. I don't want to make this inordinately long, so let's jump in. I like this picture simply because it shows this contrast between the friendly sign welcoming Democratic attendees to the convention clustered below it the Chicago police. Because of concerns about demonstrations, Mayor Richard Daley had assembled an impressive display of force. Thousands of city policemen, hundreds of state police, and several thousand National Guard troops in the city. Democratic Party deeply divided, and that's what we're going to get into more in the next few slides. David Dellinger, whom you saw interviewed in one of the clips that you watched from the documentary Chicago 68, committed pacifist who was heading a coalition of anti-war groups that had organized specifically for Chicago, calling itself the MOB, which some in Chicago took as having sinister implications, but it was simply an acronym for Mobilization Against the War. Remember what I said in the previous PowerPoint, Democratic Party deeply, bitterly divided. In the primaries, 80% of Democratic voters had voted for an anti-war candidate, either Eugene McCarthy or Robert Kennedy, and now they're stuck the candidate in Hubert Humphrey, who is vowing to continue Johnson's war policies. And so the purpose of this coalition of groups was to express their opposition to the war, but also their displeasure with the selection of Hubert Humphrey. Dellinger, as I note here, dedicated pacifist, he had vowed any demonstrations would remain peaceful in nature. On this slide, you see a picture with David Dellinger, a student activist who worked very closely with him, Rennie Davis. One of the concerns that Davis and Dellinger had was where students would stay. Now, as you might expect, the Democratic Party convention in town, hotel prices were greatly inflated. Plus, these are college students, most of them middle-class kids. They can't afford to spend several nights in a hotel with a convention in town in Chicago. Rooms were booked up anyway, hard to get. And so Davis and Dellinger are looking for alternatives, and what they wanted was permission from the city for students to camp out, essentially sleep in the city parks, primarily Lincoln Park and Grant Park downtown. And the city repeatedly turned down this request, telling them parks close at 11 p.m. We're not going to have people camping out. Also coming to Chicago, another prominent activist of the 60s, Tom Hayden, founder of Students for a Democratic Society, primary author of the influential Port Huron Statement from 1962. The mainstream media inaccurately tended to depict Hayden as a militant, which he was not. He had pledged to work with Dellinger and Davis in organizing peaceful demonstrations. He was a high-profile activist who added further luster to this coalition, the MOB. Also coming to Chicago and receiving an inordinate amount of attention, the Youth International Party, the Yippies as they called themselves, led by Abbie Hoffman, Jerry Rubin. Abbie Hoffman, a civil rights activist from New York City, Jerry Rubin, a student from Cal Berkeley who had been involved in the anti-war movement there. They had met and come up with the concept of the Yippies, which really was not an organized group in the sense that we understand it, very loose coalition of individuals. They were very skillful at getting media attention. And they did a number of things leading up to Chicago to publicize themselves and cause concern among city leadership. This is one of the Yippie posters that circulated, caused concern, describing Lincoln Park as a free motel and saying, "Come sleep with us." You see the slogan, "Vote Pig" in '68. They carried a pig around with them during this first week in August that they said was their nominee for the presidency. Hoffman and Rubin greatly exaggerated the number of yippies that would be descending on the city. And Abbie Hoffman talked about holding what he called nude-ins in Lake Michigan, where yippies would be swimming nude. My favorite threat was this one where he said the yippies were going to sneak LSD into the city water system and get the entire city high. It's absolutely absurd, but it was taken seriously by Mayor Daley and city officials who posted National Guardsmen around all the city water treatment facilities. At one point, Hoffman even said, "Well, if you pay me $100,000 to call the whole thing off." So all of this was designed to get attention, which it did, but it also angered city officials. Richard Daley, whom I've mentioned, you've read about, was really the last example of a Democratic machine mayor in a major city in the U.S. Completely opposed to the anti-war movement, determined to maintain order in the city. He didn't want any sort of event to disrupt the convention or the normal affairs of the city of Chicago himself. And as I note here, he didn't distinguish between the serious concerns of leaders like Tom Hayden, Dave Dellinger, Rennie Davis, and the more comedic demands of the yippies. All of it was just simply outrageous to him, and all of it to be strenuously opposed. So when the convention started first week in August, this nightly ritual began. Many students went ahead and camped out in Lincoln and Grant Park. And every night the Chicago police would arrive at 11 p.m. with these large trucks that you see in the right of the picture. They had these enormous kind of cannons on them that would fire out huge quantities of tear gas. And then in the midst of this fog, the police would appear wearing their gas masks and wielding their clubs, and they would start prodding and, if necessary, hitting students to get them to clear out of the park. So this caused tensions between demonstrators and the police from the get-go. And again, completely unnecessary if the city had just allowed the demonstrators to stay in the parks as they had originally requested. You saw in the one documentary clip from Chicago '68 this incident, which happens midweek when the city grudgingly finally issues a permit for a major demonstration at the bandshell in Grant Park. And during this event, a teenager spontaneously, completely on his own, climbs a flagpole, lowers the American flag, replaces it with the North Vietnamese flag, and this sets off a particular group of policemen who charge into the crowd in phalanx, clubbing anybody who gets in their way. So this attack in broad daylight was a turn in the attitudes of the demonstrators. And you saw in the documentary clip, the police particularly clubbed Rennie Davis. And Davis talks in that documentary about seeing police approach him, shouting at him, "Kill Davis." The documentary also talked about how in the middle of this attack, David Dellinger is urging the crowd to remain calm. Tom Hayden is infuriated, grabs the microphone from Dellinger, and tells demonstrators to not get caught in any large group, to float out of the park in small groups, yells, "Let this whole stinking city be violated," and vows he will meet them in the streets. Dellinger tried to lead a large group of about 6,000 people out of the park for a peaceful march to the convention hall, but was blocked by police. In the convention hall itself, the anti-war plank was being voted down. You see here Mayo Daley shouting profanity at speakers on the platform who were criticizing the tactics of the Chicago police. Later that evening, students gradually made their way to a spot on Michigan Avenue near the hotel where Humphrey was staying, and later the police simply attacked the crowd. The official investigation of this by the state of Illinois later termed this a police riot. It was captured on camera. This is what, in the account you read, that Peter Kuznick, who's a student demonstrator, was primarily talking about this incident. And the police clubbed demonstrators, they clubbed cameramen, they clubbed journalists. Many of the police had removed their badges and identifying insignia before this event, completely out of control. Interestingly, as Peter Kuznick said, Americans seeing this on television overwhelmingly sympathized with the police. So, Humphrey wins the nomination, but for people viewing this on television, it's extremely damaging to the Democratic Party. They mention here Americans tended to blame the demonstrators, not the police, for the disorder. The Democratic Party remained divided. And again, I've said this several times, but I want you to keep in mind that they mention here 2/3 of registered Democrats had voted for anti-war candidates. So there was a high degree of dissatisfaction with these results. In stark contrast, the Republican Party had a very peaceful, unified convention in Miami Beach, Florida, where Nixon talked about restoring law and order, which was a coded way, of course, of addressing the demonstrations and the seeming disorder that had gone on in Chicago. Nixon wins a narrow victory over Humphrey, fairly close election. What really determines the outcome here is the fact that George Wallace, the independent candidate, who had no chance of winning, drew 10 million popular votes nonetheless, and carried 5 southern states. These are states that had voted for Lyndon Johnson in 1964. Now they don't vote for Humphrey, and those votes made the difference between winning and losing for Humphrey and enabled Nixon to prevail. So the Tet Offensive affects American politics. It affects the presidential election. They mentioned in the first PowerPoint, Tet Offensive brings about this fundamental shift in American public opinion. Even the Republican candidate, Richard Nixon, is talking about the necessity of ending the war. The next argument is going to be how you go about doing that. And Nixon's approach, unfortunately, is going to extend the Vietnam War for several more years.